My name is Ellen, and much of my work centers around grief and death. And over the last few years, I've noticed that this topic really makes people uncomfortable. So when I tell them what I do, all of a sudden they have to make important phone calls, or they have to go to the toilet. And I can even imagine you sitting here thinking, well, I'd rather clean up my dog's poo than having to listen to a story about grief and death. Every one of us, you and me, will in some way or another have to deal with grief and death. And when we do, we will need the people around us to guide us through this. Which also means that the people that we love will need us when they are grieving. So in order to help you help them, I want to unravel some very persistent misconceptions around grief in this talk. And in order to do so, I will invite you on a stroll towards the island of grief. It's a metaphorical island, where we will look at the ravine of grief, where the people that we love reside when they are grieving. And we will look over the edge of the ravine, we will conquer our fear of heights, and we will learn how to throw them a lifeline. The good news is that if you walk with me, as with every Dutch funeral, at the end, there is a slice of cake waiting for you. The first thing we encounter when we see the island of grief is a gate. And this gate separates the people who, in our eyes, have a right to grieve and the people who we think don't have a right to grieve. So if you are 10 and you lose your parents, everybody acknowledges that you have a right to grieve. However, if you lose a parent when they are 80 or 90, then people might tell you, well, they've had a nice long life, you should be happy about that. Or for instance, when you miscarry, somebody might say to you, at least you know that you can have a child, just give it another try. We mean very well when we say these awkward things, but it's really not up to us to determine who has a right to grieve and who doesn't. Grieving occurs in many different situations. So people can grieve over losing a relationship, they can grieve over losing their jobs, their future, their countries. So there's many different reasons for grief. And I think we should all try to empathize with everyone who has suffered a loss, instead of only those people whose loss we can relate to. We've made it past the gate, and now the real journey begins. And when we think about grief, we think that we know the road, what it's going to look like, when to expect bends, when there's mountains and when there might be rivers. However, for every person, grief paints a very different landscape. Some people might cry rivers like we expect them to. Other people just sit still for months on end without showing any emotion. And it makes us sometimes uncomfortable to see people grieve in a way that we don't relate to, for instance, for longer than we expect, or without these expected bursts of sadness. What we can do to help people who are grieving is to accept that there is no such thing as a specific time for grieving. There's no specific period for how long grief can take. There's no specific emotions that belong to grief or that not belong to grief. And there is also no behavior that you can or cannot do. Grieving does not get fixed by doing what you are supposed to do. So let's try to let everybody grieve in their own way. We are getting closer to the ravine, and after taking the last few nerve-wracking steps, we are able to look down and we see something that we never expected to see. We see lots of people on swings. And every swing has a person on it, and some swings move very fast, other swings don't even seem to move at all. So there's big differences in all these swings. When people swing to the one side, they swing to the active grief side, which is where they think about what they've lost, they feel the emotions that belong to that, and they try to reflect on what has happened. When people swing to the other side, they swing to the recovery side of grief, which is where they have to deal with life that has changed. They have to distract themselves from grief, and they have to maybe do new things or figure out new ways of living. It doesn't really matter which side of grief you are at a specific moment, because both of these sides really belong to grief. And some people move very fast, so they might swing up and down every day. Other people just mostly stay on one side and only sometimes make a quick visit to the other side. It really doesn't matter. As long as the swing moves, grief is taking its natural course. I promised you to teach you how to throw grieving people a lifeline. And this lifeline is made of a very strong fiber called empathy. And empathy means that you really try to feel what another person is feeling. And I can tell you that is very hard. Because when we feel really the intense grieving emotions that the people around us might feel when they are grieving, the only thing we want to do is try to fix it. So what we do is we usually give people advice instead of just listen to them and listen to their stories. It sounds very easy to do this empathy, but beware for giving advice, because that's the last thing that people need. What you need to do is you need to be a good, loyal and accessible friend. That is the lifeline that you can throw towards people who are grieving. And that means sitting with them if they don't have the energy to do something. That might mean doing something completely unrelated to grief if they feel like they want to be distracted. It might mean just being with them and not really doing anything. So if you can be a good, loyal and accessible friend, you can help people climb out of the ravine in their own good time. Do you also feel that it's awfully quiet here? Something is missing that might make a lot of noise usually? There's no children on this island. And that is not because children don't know how to grieve or they don't grieve, but that is because children, we keep them away from grief. When we see a child in a grieving situation, we say, hey, this is not for children. But children are equally equipped as we are to deal with grief. The only thing they need to learn from us is what to do on both a practical and an emotional level. So we need to teach them how grieving occurs and what you can do when you feel these emotions. It's important to realize that children learn from our behavior and not from what we tell them. So the best thing that you can do with a child is spend time with them and spend time in this grieving situation and try to show them instead of tell them how grieving works. When I was 4, I unexpectedly lost my mother of cancer, and then when I was 21, lightning struck again, and my brother and I, we lost our father too. So I really know what it's like to be grieving as a child. And I've been trying to find something that might help children deal with grief. And I'm pretty sure that I found something. I call this the helper grown-up. And a helper grown-up is an adult from within the child's circle, from within the child's family, for instance, that is willing to help a child get through grief. And helper grown-ups can be grandparents, it can be aunts, it can be neighbors, it can be teachers, so it can be somebody that is close to the child. However, there's one thing that is really important. The helper grown-up should not be too much affected by the loss. And that can be tricky for parents, for instance, because when your child grieves, usually you grieve as a parent too. And then you're not 100% equipped to really deal with your child's grief. So I would always advise to have a helper grown-up which can stand next to the child and the parent in order to deal with this difficult situation. You don't need any specific skills to be a helper grown-up. The only thing that you need to do is spend time together. And you do that best, especially with children, when you do things together. So you can do the dishes, or you can drive them to swimming practice, or maybe you can walk the dog. It doesn't really matter what you do. The child needs to find a way of bonding with you, and when they do, they will be able to share their innermost feelings with you, and that's what grieving and helping with grief is about. Whatever you do, you cannot solve grief. Grief is not fixable. The only thing we can do is to try to be a good, loyal and accessible friend and try to help to keep the swing moving from the active grief side to the recovery side. What we can do is accept that there's no specific emotions and no set time that grievers should work within. We need to let people grieve in their own way. And we need to create room for their feelings by really, really listening to them. And I've already told you how difficult that can be. We need to let people be with whatever they are feeling. And that's really tricky. We can also help on a practical level. So you can maybe cook dinner for somebody, or you can walk the dog, or you can, I don't know, do the dishes. Something that really helps a person on a practical level. And it's really important to remember that you can do this for years instead of months. Usually we feel that after a couple of months grief should be finished, but it might take a lot of years. Don't tell a person that is grieving, let me know if you need me. That's I would say, the sentence that we always say to people who are grieving. But when you are in the ravine of grief, it's really hard to reach out to other people. So don't let them dangle there on their lifeline, but really pull them up by doing something active for them. Loss and mourning is a big part of my job, and even though it might make some of you uncomfortable, I still think it's my dream job, because I get to create things that help people navigate the island of grief, which, sad as it sounds, has hope on the horizon. And let's go and eat some cake.